there is something uniquely terrifying about silence. Not the silence of a quiet street at night or the silence that lingers between two people who love each other but have run out of words. No. The silence that truly kills is the silence of a town that knows the truth but chooses to bury it, to cover it with a smile, a prayer, or a polite wave across the street. That silence does not soothe. It suffocates. It hangs heavy like smoke after a fire, seeping into your lungs until you can no longer breathe, a silence that says, "We know what is happening, but we will not speak of it. We will not interfere. We will wait for someone else to take the burden. And if no one does, then so be it. We will live with the rot and pretend it isn't there." And yet, this silence isn't born out of ignorance. It is born out of fear, out of shame, out of the primal instinct to protect oneself at the expense of another. To live in a community is to accept the unspoken rules. Do not stir the water. Do not point at the rot. Do not scream when you see the monster in the window. The irony is, of course, that the monster is rarely the creature lurking in the shadows. More often, the monster is us, our refusal to confront, our eagerness to laugh at someone else's pain so we can avoid feeling our own, our willingness to sit still while cruelty festers, as long as it isn't directed at us. It was Stephen King, through The Children of Derry, who understood this better than most in It. The monster isn't just Pennywise, that grotesque clown feeding on fear and flesh. The monster is also the collective blindness of adults, the way they avert their eyes from the bruises on Beverly Marsh's body, the way they ignore Henry Bowers's cruelty, or worse, enable it, the way entire generations choose not to see the blood flowing in the drains, not to hear the screams echoing from the sewers. And when you ask them why, when you force them to account for their silence, they shrug, or they smile, or they look at the ground, because the truth would demand action, and action requires courage. And courage is in short supply when you've lived your whole life feeding off the illusion that if you don't name evil, maybe it won't see you. But silence is not neutral. Silence is complicity dressed in quiet clothes. Every time a child is mocked and no one stands up, silence grows teeth. Every time a woman whispers about the violence in her home and the neighbors turn their heads, silence sharpens its claws. Every time injustice is witnessed but left unspoken, silence becomes a predator, and it waits patiently, knowing that the next victim will not just be the one suffering in the moment, it will be all of us. Because rot does not stop spreading simply because you choose not to smell it. Have you ever wondered why it's easier to laugh at the wounded than to defend them? Why it's simpler to whisper behind someone's back than to stand in front of them and say, "I see you. I will not let this happen"? It's because cruelty is contagious, but so is cowardice. There's comfort in the mob. Even when the mob is cruel, there's safety in blending in. Even when blending in means swallowing down your own disgust until it burns your stomach. It's the psychology of survival twisted against itself. Our need to belong becomes the very reason we betray the best parts of ourselves. We tell ourselves we are protecting our children, our reputations, our peace. But what kind of peace is it, really, when it is built on the bones of another's suffering? The tragedy of Derry is not unique. Every town, every community, every family carries a shadow like that. The things we don't speak of, the truths we bury in the backyard, the shame we inherit like old furniture passed down through generations. We hide it behind small talk, Sunday dinners, polite nods at church, but silence has a way of seeping out. Children feel it. They feel the tension in the room when a name is spoken. They see the flinch when a certain subject is raised. And the unspoken rule gets passed down. Do not name it. Do not fight it. Pretend. Pretend harder until the pretending becomes reality. Until the truth becomes myth. Until the myth becomes nothing at all. But deep down, we know the truth doesn't die just because we starve it of words. It waits. It festers. It transforms into something darker. And then, when it rises, whether as violence, as tragedy, or as the sudden collapse of everything we thought was safe, we act surprised. We clutch our chests and say, "How could this happen?" But the answer is always the same. It happened because we let it. It happened because silence is not a shield, it is an invitation. The psychology of silence is a study in rationalization. Every person who chooses to look away tells themselves a story. It's not my place. They'll be fine. Someone else will step in. This isn't my fight. But these are not truths. These are excuses, soft blankets we pull over our eyes so we can sleep at night. The real truth is harsher when we look away. We are betting on someone else's pain to protect our own comfort. We are gambling with the lives of others, hoping the wheel will not spin back to us. But it always does, because silence does not just harm the victim. It corrodes the witness. It hollows out the one who could have spoken but chose not to. It teaches us to live half lives, to exist in a state of denial so constant that we forget what courage even feels like. And when that happens, when enough of us have been hollowed out by silence, then the town itself becomes a ghost, alive on the surface, but dead inside. And maybe that is the scariest truth of all. That the horror is not the monster we imagine lurking in the sewers, but the monster we become when we convince ourselves that silence is safety, that ignoring is survival. That looking away is wisdom. The children in it were forced to confront what the adults would not. They had to descend into the darkness because the town chose not to. And isn't that the story of every generation? The young inherit the nightmares the old refuse to name, so when a town chooses silence over truth, it is not just the victim who pays, it is the children, it is the future, it is the soul of the place itself, and eventually, that silence always comes due. It arrives like a scream in the night, like a tragedy on the front page, like a moment you cannot undo. And then we realize too late that silence was never neutral. It was a choice that reshaped everything. When a mistake is made, the mind rushes to defend itself. It creates narratives, excuses, ways of softening the edges of guilt so the reflection in the mirror doesn't shatter completely. But what happens when the mistake is not yours alone, when it belongs to an entire community? An entire town that has chosen silence? That mistake becomes heavier, darker, more suffocating than any individual sin. Because now it lives in the walls, in the air, in the cracked pavement of the sidewalks. It becomes part of the identity of the place. Criminal psychology teaches us that most crimes are not born in a single explosive act, but in a long series of small justifications. A shove here, a laugh there, a decision to walk away instead of step forward, a failure to question the easy lie because the lie makes the night quieter. A mistake doesn't always look like a mistake in the moment. It looks like the safer choice, the more convenient option, And yet, when you string enough of these moments together, you build a prison out of your own cowardice. You teach yourself that staying silent is the only path, until silence becomes a habit, and the habit becomes a curse. Think of the children in It. Each of them faced the monstrous reality of Pennywise. Yes, but just as frightening was the monstrous apathy of their parents and neighbors. Beverly's bruises weren't invisible. Eddie's suffocating mother wasn't a mystery. Bill's grief wasn't something you could fail to notice. And yet the town moved on, blind by choice. That blindness wasn't just neglect. It was criminal in its own way. A refusal to act when action was necessary. A refusal to intervene when intervention could have changed everything. Silence, when weaponized against truth, is no different than violence. It cuts, it wounds, it destroys, and yet, this is what makes silence seductive. It offers the illusion of safety. If you don't speak, you can't be wrong. If you don't step forward, you can't be punished. If you don't look too closely, you can't be forced to carry the unbearable weight of responsibility. But every time we take that bargain, we give up a piece of our own humanity. We trade compassion for convenience, morality for self-preservation. It's a transaction we don't even notice until it's too late. There is something chilling about a mistake that everyone knows about but no one admits to. It creates a collective guilt, an unspoken knowledge that saturates the air like humidity before a storm. And the worst part is that this guilt doesn't unite, it divides. Instead of banding together in truth, people splinter apart in shame, whispering in corners, pointing fingers, shifting blame. The victim becomes a scapegoat, a symbol of everything the community refuses to acknowledge. Their suffering is dismissed, minimized, turned into gossip, because to take it seriously would demand accountability. And accountability is terrifying, isn't it? To admit that you saw something and did nothing. To confess that you laughed when you should have resisted. To accept that silence was your crime. But without accountability, mistakes metastasize. They grow roots in the soil of the town and sprout new cruelties with each passing year. And then you look around and wonder why the place feels haunted. It isn't haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by silence. This is the essence of emotional struggle. The war between the self that wants to believe it is good and the self that knows it has failed. People are not evil by nature, but they become cruel through neglect, through fear, through the constant choosing of silence over truth. And when that pattern is reinforced, when children watch their parents look away, when neighbors exchange knowing glances but no words, that silence becomes tradition, a generational curse. The sins of the fathers carried by the sons, not because of what was done, but because of what was left undone. What's most terrifying is that this silence doesn't just protect the guilty, it empowers them. The bully becomes bolder when no one resists. The abuser grows stronger when no one intervenes. The predator sharpens its teeth when the crowd turns away. Silence is the soil in which cruelty grows. It doesn't just permit the monster, it feeds it. And here lies the ultimate paradox. Silence feels like safety, but it is the very thing that puts us most at risk. Because once a community has learned to look away, once it has trained itself to ignore the obvious, then no one is truly safe. Today, it is the bruises on a girl's arm. Tomorrow, it is the scream in the night. Next week, it is your own child who disappears. Your own name whispered in fear. Your own suffering met with the same blank stares you once gave someone else. In it, the Losers Club broke the cycle not because they were braver by nature, but because they were too young to have fully learned the habit of silence. They had not yet surrendered completely to the rules of pretending. So they spoke the truth, others would not. They faced what adults had trained themselves not to see. That is the cruel inheritance of silence. It demands the next generation fight battles the last refuse to acknowledge. And the cost is always higher, the wounds always deeper, because rot left unchecked does not simply fade, it spreads. And isn't that what we fear most in our quiet moments? That our refusal to speak, our decision to bury the truth, will one day come back not just to haunt us, but to consume us. That the mistakes we refuse to admit will grow claws, and by the time we decide to fight, it will already be too late. That the silence we thought was safety will reveal itself as the sharpest blade, cutting through everything we thought we had preserved. So the question becomes, what is the price of silence, and who pays it first? The price of silence is rarely paid all at once. It is not a clean cut, not a single moment of catastrophe that can be easily traced and understood. Instead, it bleeds out slowly, like poison in the bloodstream, invisible at first, but deadly in its patience. The first payment is always made by the most vulnerable. The child who has no voice, the woman whose cries are dismissed, the outcast whose pain is mocked. They carry the heaviest weight because no one else will. But silence never stops with them. It ripples outward, creeping into every corner of the community, until one day those who thought they were safe find themselves staring into the same abyss. Fear and morality live in constant war within us. Fear whispers, "Do nothing, keep quiet, protect yourself." Morality answers, "Speak, act, even if it costs you." Most of us think we know what side we would choose when the moment comes. But when the moment does arrive, fear is always louder. Fear carries with it the sound of your own heartbeat, the weight of your own children, the fragile fabric of your reputation. Fear makes morality seem like a luxury, and so we convince ourselves that silence is not just safer, it is wiser. But wisdom without compassion is just cowardice with better vocabulary. We forget that truth has power, but only when spoken aloud. An unspoken truth rots like fruit left to wither in the dark. It does not protect anyone. It does not redeem anyone. It festers until it breeds monsters of its own. And what are monsters, really? If not truths we've refused to face, solidified into flesh. Pennywise is just a shape for the thing the town of Derry would not confront. The true horror was not the clown. The true horror was the silence that let the clown feed without resistance for generations. When we talk about purpose, we like to imagine grand visions, saving the world, curing the sick, ending suffering. But perhaps the truest purpose is simpler: to refuse silence when silence is dangerous, to break the chain of complicity that strangles entire generations, to say the word that no one else dares to say. That is not glory. That is not heroism in the cinematic sense. It is uncomfortable, lonely, even humiliating. It costs you friends, status, maybe even your own safety, but it plants something that silence can never plant: change. Because silence has an outcome, just as truth does. Silence builds towns like Derry, haunted, festering, pretending at normalcy while the foundations crumble beneath. Truth builds scars, yes, but scars are proof of healing. Truth costs us blood. But silence costs us our soul, and when the soul of a community is gone, what remains is not a town, but a graveyard. No matter how many children laugh in the playground, no matter how many shop windows gleam in the sunlight. What makes compassion radical is not that it feels good, it's that it demands action when action is most frightening. Compassion is not just empathy, it is courage wearing the face of empathy. It is the refusal to let another person carry their pain alone, even when standing beside them paints a target on your own back. That is why compassion feels so rare in places poisoned by silence, because compassion requires you to look at the thing everyone else is pretending not to see, to feel it, to name it, and to let it shape you into something braver. But the cruelest part of silence is not what it does to the victim. It is what it does to the one who stays quiet. Emotional turmoil feeds on itself. The more we look away, the more fractured we become inside. We feel it in sleepless nights, in the gnawing shame that visits when the world grows quiet. We bury it under distractions, under busyness, under excuses, but it never leaves. We cannot unknow what we know, cannot unsee what we have seen. Silence does not erase truth. It only makes us complicit in it, and so the inner voice grows restless, whispering, "You could have spoken. You could have changed something. You could have saved them." That is the real horror of silence, that it leaves us with no way out if we speak too late. We are condemned by what we allowed to happen. If we never speak at all, we are condemned by our own reflection. And when enough people share that condemnation, when an entire town stares into mirrors they no longer trust, the very identity of the community shatters. It becomes not a place of belonging, but a theater of pretense, where everyone plays the role of a good neighbor while knowing, deep down, they have already failed each other. The inner turmoil then becomes unbearable. We look for someone else to blame, someone else to carry the shame we refuse to hold. We mock the victim. We demonize the outsider. We build stories about why they deserved it, why it was never our fault. But these are lies layered over wounds that never close. The truth festers beneath, waiting for the day when silence can no longer contain it. And when it bursts, it does so with violence, psychological, emotional, sometimes physical. It becomes the very nightmare we thought we could avoid by looking away. And so the question lingers, like the shadow of a storm on the horizon. What happens when an entire town chooses silence over truth? What becomes of its people, its children, its legacy? The answer is both simple and devastating. The town decays, the children inherit the nightmares, and the silence itself becomes the loudest scream. The longer a town lives in silence, the more it teaches its people that silence is normal. It becomes ritual, almost holy in its enforcement. Neighbors learn to smile with their mouths while locking their eyes, pretending not to notice the bruises, the whispers, the disappearances. Children absorb it like secondhand smoke, watching how adults shrug, how they switch the subject, how they keep their voices low whenever truth threatens to surface. And so silence becomes inheritance, passed from generation to generation, not as a lesson, but as an instinct. There is a cruelty in this inheritance. It strips children of their innocence before they even understand what innocence is. It tells them, your pain is not important. Your suffering is not worth naming in it. When Beverly tells the adults about her father, their eyes glaze over. When Bill's parents lose Georgie, They close themselves off, cocooned in grief so dense that they leave Bill to drown in it alone. This is how silence works. It isolates. It privatizes tragedy, turning collective pain into individual burdens that crush the smallest shoulders. And yet, deep within this cycle, there is always resistance. Some inner voice refuses to be smothered. Some flicker of conscience still alive despite the years of enforced quiet. That is where change begins, not with loud proclamations or heroic gestures, but with a whisper that refuses to die. The Losers Club were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were simply unwilling to accept silence as their inheritance. They were children who had not yet learned to look away. And that refusal made them dangerous. Dangerous not just to Pennywise, but to the very culture of denial that fed him. Human morality, in its rawest form, is not about knowing what is right. It is about acting on it when fear tells you not to. Every person knows, deep down, the difference between justice and cruelty. The problem is not ignorance. The problem is courage. We twist morality into something convenient so we can live with ourselves, so we can sleep at night. But morality that bends for convenience is no morality at all. It is just another form of silence. The danger of silence is that it transforms victims into shadows, erases their stories, and eventually convinces the community they never existed at all. Think of every missing child, every unspoken act of cruelty, every wound dismissed as exaggeration. Over time, silence rewrites the narrative. It wasn't that bad. It was their fault. It never happened. This is not just neglect. It is violence through erasure. A kind of slow, suffocating murder where the victim disappears twice, once in the act itself, and again in the silence that follows. But silence does more than destroy the victim. It destroys the witnesses. Every time you choose not to act, you chip away at your own humanity. The first time, it stings. The second time, it aches. By the 10th time, you don't even notice. You have trained yourself to look away, to shrug, to move on. This is how ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil, not through action, but through silence. And yet, if silence can be learned, so can its opposite. If cruelty is contagious, so is compassion, the act of speaking, the act of standing up, is a spark that others can see. One person breaking the silence gives permission for others to do the same. This is why oppressors fear the truth so deeply, because they know that once spoken, it cannot be contained. Truth does not need an army, it needs only a voice, and silence begins to crumble. Still, the cost is real. Speaking breaks the illusion of safety. It isolates you from the comfort of the crowd. It paints a target on your back, makes you vulnerable in ways silence never would. But that is the paradox. The very vulnerability of speaking is what makes it powerful. It forces others to confront what they have denied. It turns invisible wounds into undeniable scars. It names what silence tried to erase. And once something is named, it cannot be ignored. But here is the question that gnaws at the bones of every society, every family, every individual, when the time comes, when you are faced with the choice between silence and truth. Which will you choose? Will you blend into the safety of the crowd, hoping the storm passes over you? Or will you step into the storm knowing it may consume you? Because the storm always comes. Silence cannot stop it. It can only delay it. And the longer it is delayed, the more destructive it becomes. The question is not whether the truth will surface. It always does. The question is when it does. Will you be the one who buried it, or the one who dared to speak it into the light? And this is where the heart of the struggle lies, the place between fear and conscience, between survival and dignity. Every town that has chosen silence believes it is buying peace. But peace bought with silence is counterfeit. It is a mask stretched tight over a wound that will never close. Eventually, the mask cracks, and when it does, the wound bleeds not only for the victim, but for everyone who once convinced themselves they were safe behind the wall of silence. Think of how silence twists memory. A town that once laughed at the weak convinces itself it was only joking. A community that ignored abuse tells itself it was not their business. A parent who looked the other way swears they never knew. But memory is not so easily rewritten. The mind carries the weight of what it refused to confront. It echoes in the quiet moments. It shadows every new mistake. You can drown it in liquor, bury it in work, silence it with prayer, but it remains, whispering, "You saw, you knew, you did nothing." And isn't that the cruelest punishment? Not the judgment of others, but the judgment you cannot escape within yourself. A town that chooses silence lives in collective self-betrayal. People walk the same streets, shop at the same stores, nod to each other in passing, but beneath the politeness, there is the unspoken knowledge. We all failed. It makes every smile hollow, every Sunday sermon ring false, every 4th of July firework explode like a reminder of what was buried instead of faced. This is why the psychology of silence is so dangerous. It convinces us that by doing nothing, we are innocent. But innocence does not survive in silence. It rots. And what replaces it is complicity. You may not have held the knife, but if you watched it fall and said nothing, your hands are not clean. You may not have fed the monster, but if you stood by while others did, then you kept the table set. There is a passage in it that lingers long after the pages are closed. The children realize that Pennywise thrives not just on fear, but on the permission of silence. The town's refusal to acknowledge him is what gives him strength. Isn't that the way all evil grows? Not because it is too strong, but because too many people stand by, whispering excuses while hoping someone else will carry the burden. But here is the truth no one wants to face. Silence is never free. It always comes with a debt, and when the debt is collected, it is not just the guilty who pay, it is everyone. The debt takes shape as generations carrying trauma they didn't create, as children inheriting nightmares that should have been confronted long before they were born. It becomes entire communities haunted, not by ghosts, but by their own reflection. We tell ourselves that time will heal what silence conceals. But time does not heal lies. It only deepens them, buries them until they become part of the soil, the air, the water, until one day you wake up and realize the silence you thought was protection has become the very curse that defines you. And maybe that is the darkest truth of all. Silence does not just protect the monster, it becomes the monster. It devours compassion, corrodes trust, and leaves behind only fear dressed up as civility. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, when truth stands before you demanding to be spoken, when silence curls its arm around your shoulder and whispers, "Stay quiet, stay safe," will you listen? Or will you finally break the chain? Because this is what happens when a town chooses silence over truth. It loses itself. Its people become actors in a play they never agreed to perform, trapped in roles written by fear, and the only way to break free is to shatter the silence, no matter the cost. But will you? The silence of a town is not just absence of words. It is architecture. It is bricks and mortar laid into the foundation of daily life. It is in the way teachers ignore the bruises on a child's arms, the way priests preach forgiveness without demanding accountability, the way neighbors close their blinds when the shouting next door gets too loud. Silence builds itself into the schoolyard, into the church pews, into the grocery aisles where people nod politely and move on. And one day, it becomes indistinguishable from the town itself, but no structure, no matter how carefully built, can withstand the pressure of buried truth forever. Cracks appear. Sometimes they are small. A child who suddenly lashes out in rage they can't explain. A family that falls apart under the weight of secrets. Sometimes they are catastrophic. A murder, a disappearance, a tragedy that no one can ignore. And when the cracks widen, the town is forced to face what it tried so desperately to hide. But by then, the damage has already been done. The silence has already written itself into the bones of the community. Fear convinces us that breaking silence will destroy us. But the irony is that silence itself is the destroyer. It eats at the moral fabric of a place until all that's left is apathy disguised as normalcy. You see it in Derry, where Pennywise thrives not because he is invincible, but because people are too afraid to name him. You see it in every town that whispers about the darkness in its midst, but never confronts it. The evil doesn't need to be strong. It needs only to be ignored. And isn't that the most damning revelation of all? That monsters do not feed on strength, but on silence? That they require not our courage, but our fear, our willingness to turn away? Pennywise was not defeated by adults with authority or power. He was defeated by children who refused to stay silent, children who had every reason to be afraid, every excuse to run, but chose instead to face what everyone else denied. They spoke the unspeakable. They entered the places no one dared to go. And in doing so, they revealed the one truth that silence always tries to hide. Monsters are never as strong as they seem when you name them. But here is the tragedy. Why does it always fall to children? Why do the innocent have to bear the burden of courage that adults should have carried? Because silence is not just cowardice. It is inheritance. When a town refuses to face its darkness, the weight passes to the next generation. The children inherit the fear, the trauma, the responsibility. And in that inheritance lies the most unforgivable cruelty of all. So what happens when silence finally breaks? When the truth can no longer be contained? It rarely bursts forth as healing. More often, it erupts as chaos, violence, destruction. Because when you bury pain long enough, it doesn't vanish. It transforms. It becomes rage. It becomes revenge. It becomes the kind of fire that consumes everything in its path. And still, people act surprised. They say, "We never saw it coming." But they did. They always did. They just chose silence. And here lies the open wound. Silence does not make you innocent. It only makes you blind. And blindness, chosen deliberately, is nothing less than guilt. So I ask you this. When your town, your family, your circle faces its next moment of truth, when silence seems easier, safer, less costly? Will you stay quiet, or will you speak, knowing that words carry risk but also salvation? Because silence has a price, and if you will not pay it now, your children surely will. Silence is seductive because it feels clean. It does not demand blood. It does not demand confrontation. It does not demand that you tear down the fragile scaffolding of your daily life. Speaking the truth feels messy, dangerous, unpredictable. It throws you into the chaos of conflict. Silence, on the other hand, feels like order. It tells you that if you keep still long enough, the storm will pass. But storms do not pass. They wait. They circle above until the silence below is so absolute, so complicit, that the storm knows it can finally strike with maximum force. That is why whole towns collapse under the weight of a single revelation. It is never the revelation itself that destroys them. It is the silence that came before. The silence that allowed cruelty to root itself so deeply that by the time it was named, it had already grown into a forest of horrors. The revelation only unmasks what was always there, and once unmasked, the town cannot bear its own reflection. There is something almost criminal in this, not just in the act of ignoring, but in the way silence manufactures lies to protect itself. The story changes. Victims become exaggerators. Witnesses become unreliable. The guilty become misunderstood. Slowly, silence writes its own mythology, until truth is not just hidden, but rewritten. In the courtroom of a silent town, the monster always walks free, while the ones who tried to speak are punished as troublemakers. And isn't that the final cruelty? That silence not only protects the guilty, but damns the innocent twice in it. The children's fight was not only against Pennywise, but against the very gravity of that silence. They weren't just battling fear. They were battling the pull of forgetting, the temptation to pretend, the lure of returning to safety. That is why their bond mattered so deeply. Because speaking truth is impossible alone. One voice is easy to silence, a chorus is harder, and so they held on to each other, not because it erased their fear, but because it gave them the strength to name it. This is where the lesson cuts deepest. Breaking silence is not about eradicating fear. It is about moving through fear with enough courage to plant a seed of change. And courage does not always roar. It sometimes whispers. It sometimes takes the form of a trembling voice that says, "I saw, I know. I will not look away anymore." That whisper can feel small, even useless. But it is the crack in the wall, and cracks spread. But here is the part no one wants to admit. Most people will never take that step. Most will cling to silence until it swallows them whole, because silence is easier, safer, more comfortable. It allows them to keep their dinners warm, their hands clean, their sleep undisturbed. And maybe that is why the world never runs out of monsters, because it never runs out of people willing to stay quiet. Still, the question remains, circling like a vulture above every community, every family, every individual life. If silence is the monster, then who will break it? Who will speak the word that shatters the illusion? Who will risk being shunned, mocked, isolated, or even destroyed just to tear down the curtain of denial? Because this is what happens when a town chooses silence over truth. It decays from the inside out. It teaches its children that fear is stronger than love, that cruelty is safer than compassion, that forgetting is easier than remembering. It builds a world where monsters do not need to hide, because the people will hide for them. And so I leave you with a question that lingers long after the story ends, long after the credits roll, long after the book is closed. When the moment comes for you to choose silence or truth, what will you do? Will you let the town crumble beneath the weight of its own cowardice? Or will you stand, trembling and afraid, but unyielding? Because the future of every community, every family, every soul depends on that single choice.